She was a billionaire's wife, a woman who had clawed her way from homelessness to an empire with nothing but bleeding hands and a refusing to quit heart. But on the very night she gave birth to triplets, the hospital monitors began screaming, her pulse flatlined on the chart, and the doctors rushed in with the kind of controlled panic that silences every room. The billionaire stood at the glass window of the delivery ward, his jaw tight, not with grief, but with calculation. Because 24 hours earlier, his voice had been low and deliberate on a phone call he thought his wife could not hear. After the babies come, we move fast. Everything she built, it's ours. His mistress had laughed on the other end of that call. A warm, familiar laugh, the laugh of a best friend. But his wife had been awake. She had been awake, still, barely breathing, her eyes shut and her mind recording every single word like a courtroom stenographer. She had been suspicious for weeks. The late calls, the cologne that wasn't his, the way her best friend always seemed to know things only a wife should know. So when that phone call confirmed what her gut had screamed for months, she didn't cry. She didn't break. She made a decision. And now, as the monitors screamed dying and the nurses moved with urgent hands, his arrogant mistress, the same best friend this wife had pulled from the streets, given a salary, given a title, given a seat at the very table she built, was not weeping. She was in the corridor, dressed pristine, champagne-colored nails wrapped around her phone, celebrating quietly, a smile she couldn't hide, a future she thought was finally arriving. She had no idea she was unaware that the woman on that bed had pretended, that every gasp, every flatline, every doctor's grim face was a performance choreographed with surgical precision, designed specifically to test her husband and expose them both. But what the doctor revealed when he walked out of that delivery room didn't just shock the billionaire. It shattered the version of his life he thought he had already won. And what his wife did next, a woman who had once been thrown out of her own parents' house, called a curse, stripped of everything, was so unimaginable that even the doctor who helped her had to pause and ask himself if he had underestimated her all along. Who was this woman really? How deep did her plan go? And when the truth finally came out about the husband, the mistress, the babies, and the empire, whose world would be left standing? Stay with us. You're about to witness what happens when the woman everyone underestimated decides she's done pretending. Dear viewers, this story is about betrayal, resilience, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from a woman who has already survived her worst day and knows exactly what she's doing. You will learn that the people closest to you can be your greatest threat, that suffering can sharpen you instead of breaking you, and that patience and silence can be the most powerful weapon a person carries. After watching, drop in the comments. What lesson did you take from this story? And if you were in her shoes, what would you have done differently? Subscribe now for more powerful, life-changing stories like this one. The city never truly slept, but at 2:47 in the morning, it at least had the decency to lower its voice. Vivian Hartford lay in the private maternity suite on the 14th floor of Crestwell Medical Center, her body heavy with the final hours of a pregnancy that had been harder than anyone outside that room would ever know. The room was immaculate, ivory walls, soft gold lighting, a view of the skyline that her husband, Donovan Hartford, had specifically requested when he booked the suite 6 months ago. He had made a show of it, flowers on the table, a card that said, "For my whole world." The nurses had cooed. Vivian had smiled the smile she had perfected over 3 years of marriage. Warm enough to convince, careful enough to hide. But tonight, something in her had gone very still. It had started 3 weeks ago, a feeling she could not name but could not shake. The way Donovan checked his phone face down now, the faint trace of a perfume that was not hers on the collar of a shirt he swore he had worn to a business dinner. The way her best friend Camille Rowe had started visiting less and calling more. Always slightly too eager to know how Vivian was feeling, how the pregnancy was progressing, when exactly the due date was. Small things. But Vivian had not built a billion-dollar enterprise by ignoring small things. She had her eyes closed when Donovan stepped out of the room. She had been awake for 11 minutes already. His voice, when it came through the barely open door, was low, the specific low of a man who believed the woman behind him was asleep. She's fine, still resting. They say it could be tomorrow morning. A pause, then a soft exhale that carried something close to relief. But not the relief of a worried husband, the relief of a man whose timeline was still intact. After the babies come, we move fast. Everything she built, it's ours, the company, the real estate portfolio, all of it. I've already spoken to the lawyers. Another pause. The sound of Camille's laugh. Light, certain, the laugh of someone who had already begun spending money she had not yet stolen. And the babies? Donovan's answer came without hesitation, without even the flinch of a man who understood what he was saying. The orphanage in Westfield. Clean. Quiet. Nobody will ask questions. Vivian did not move. Not a finger. Not a breath that wasn't measured. Because she had learned a long time ago, Hannah, that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could do was let the wrong people know what she knew. She had learned that lesson young. Too young. She was 19 when her parents died within 6 months of each other, her mother first from a stroke, her father from a grief that wore the shape of heart failure. She had barely had time to bury them both before her father's family descended. Aunts and uncles she had seen maybe 3 times in her life, arriving at the family home in good clothes and bad intentions. They called her a bad luck child. They said it with the certainty of people who needed a reason that wasn't greed. Within a month, they had leveraged an obscure clause in a will that had suspiciously been updated weeks before her father died. And they took everything: the family company, the 2 properties, the accounts. They left her with a suitcase and a door closed firmly in her face. She was 19, homeless, and completely alone. But she had her mind, and she had a refusal. Quiet, absolute, the kind that doesn't announce itself, to become the story they told about her. She worked 3 jobs simultaneously for 14 months. She slept in a women's shelter for the first 4. She saved with the discipline of someone who understood that money was not just currency, it was protection. When she had enough, she started small. A courier service, then a logistics company, then a real estate acquisition that tripled in value within 2 years. By 26, she had outgrown every ceiling they told her she would never reach. By 29, she was a name. By 31, she was the kind of woman who got invited to rooms where decisions were made. It was in one of those rooms that she met Donovan Hartford. Charming, intelligent, and just struggling enough to make her feel safe loving him. She had believed every word he said. She had made him the head of her company because she thought that was what love looked like. Building someone up, trusting them with everything. But tonight, through a door left 2 inches open, she understood the full cost of that trust. She lay perfectly still as Donovan returned to the room, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Sleep, my love." She did not sleep. She began to plan. What exactly is Vivian planning? And who is the one person in that hospital she is about to call in the middle of the night? The one person whose help will make everything possible. There is a particular kind of courage that makes no sound. It does not announce itself. It does not tremble visibly or demand witnesses. It simply decides, and then moves with the cold, quiet precision of a woman who has already done the hardest thing she will ever do, which was survive the first time the world tried to erase her. At 3:14 in the morning, while Donovan Hartford slept in the reclining chair beside her bed, with the practiced ease of a man whose conscience had long since been negotiated into silence, Vivian reached for her phone beneath the thin hospital blanket. Her fingers found it without a sound. She opened her contacts, scrolled past names that now felt like question marks, and stopped at one: Dr. Elliot Carver, Chief of Obstetrics. She had met Dr. Carver 4 months into her pregnancy, when her previous doctor had relocated. From their first appointment, something about him had registered as trustworthy. Not because he was warm, though he was, but because he was precise. He said exactly what he meant. He never performed reassurance he didn't believe. In a life where Vivian had learned to read people the way a cartographer reads terrain, carefully looking for where the ground might give, Elliot Carver had read as solid. She was about to find out if she was right. She typed the message slowly, each word deliberate. "I need to speak with you privately, tonight. It cannot wait, and it cannot involve anyone else on staff. I am not in danger, but I need your help to make everyone believe I am." She watched the screen. 60 seconds passed. Then his reply came. 3 words that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. "I'm coming now." Dr. Carver arrived in 7 minutes, still in his street clothes beneath his white coat, a coffee he hadn't finished still in his hand. He closed the door behind him without being asked, glanced once at the sleeping Donovan, and moved to Vivian's bedside with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that whatever this was, it was serious. Vivian told him everything. She did not cry. She did not editorialize. She laid the facts out in sequence. The overheard phone call, Donovan's words, Camille's laugh, the orphanage in Westfield, the legal maneuvers already in motion, and she watched Elliot's face move through the information the way a storm moves across open water, controlled on the surface, a transformative underneath. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Vivian had already thought it through. She needed the monitors to tell a story. She needed the medical staff to perform urgency without knowing it was performance. She needed Donovan to believe, completely and without doubt, that his wife was slipping away. Because only a man who believed he had already won would lower every guard and say every incriminating thing out loud. And she needed it all recorded. Elliot set down his coffee. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "My wife passed 3 years ago," he said quietly, not as a digression, but as a declaration. "She left me the hospital because she said I was the only person she had ever met who treated people the way they deserved to be treated. I would like to think I still am." He straightened. "I'll make the necessary adjustments to the monitoring system. The readings will look critical. The staff will respond to what they see. You will need to perform your part convincingly." A pause. "Can you do that?" Vivian looked at the man asleep in the chair across the room. The man who had eaten at her table, used her name, spent her money, and looked her in the eyes every morning, knowing what he was planning. "I've been performing for 3 years," she said. "Tonight, I finally get to perform for myself." By the time labor began in earnest the following morning, everything was in place. Vivian delivered her triplets, 2 boys and a girl, in a room that held its breath. The babies were healthy, strong, furious with life in the way that only newborns can be, their cries filling the suite like a verdict. But before the room could settle into relief, the monitors shifted. The numbers dropped. The alarm sounded. And the nurses, reading exactly what the equipment told them, moved with the controlled urgency of people responding to a real crisis. Donovan was escorted to the corridor. His face arranged itself into concern, but his hand at his side was already reaching for his phone. Through the glass, beneath closed eyelids, Vivian watched the shape of him, and her own phone, tucked beneath the blanket beside her hip, was already recording. Down the hall, Camille Rose stood up from her waiting room chair when she heard the alarms. She smoothed her coat. She breathed in slowly, and she smiled. She had no idea that smile was being captured too. By the corridor camera Elliot had quietly ensured was functioning at full capacity before his shift began. The trap had been set. The performance had begun. But what neither Donovan nor Camille understood, what they could not have accounted for, because they had never truly known the woman they were trying to destroy, was that Vivian Hartford did not build a billion-dollar empire by leaving loose ends. She had not just recorded the corridor, she had recorded everything. What exactly did Vivian record, and how far back does the evidence go? And when Donovan makes his move, believing his wife is dying, and the door is finally open, what does he do first? What does he say? And who is listening to every single word? There is a moment, sharp, irreversible, the kind that splits a life cleanly into before and after, when a person shows you exactly who they are, not who they performed, not who they dressed themselves as over years of careful presentation, but who they actually are, in the specific privacy of a moment they believe no one important is watching. Donovan Hartford had his moment at 11:23 in the morning, standing in the corridor outside his wife's delivery suite, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice dropped to the register he reserved for conversations he intended to disappear. "The monitors crashed after delivery," he said. "They're saying it's critical. It could be hours." A pause. Camille's voice on the other end, asking something. Donovan's answer came smooth and rehearsed, in the way answers do when they have been practiced in private for a long time. I've already contacted the firm. The power of attorney activates the moment she's declared. We don't wait. We move the same day. The accounts, the property holdings, the company shares. All of it transfers before anyone can file an injunction. His voice dropped further. I had her sign the amendment 6 months ago. She thought it was a tax restructuring document. Down the hall, Camille sat perfectly upright in a waiting room chair, her long legs crossed, her champagne-colored nails tapping once against her phone case. She was not weeping. She was not pacing. She was doing the thing she had always done best, waiting, beautifully, for someone else's loss to become her opportunity. She thought about the apartment in Vancouver. She and Donovan had chosen it together 3 months ago. During a weekend she had told Vivian was a solo wellness retreat. She thought about the account in the Cayman Islands that now held enough of Donovan's quietly redirected funds to begin a life that looked nothing like the one she was currently living. She thought about how, for 2 years, she had sat across dinner tables from Vivian, laughing at her jokes, holding her hand through the pregnancy scares, being called the sister I chose, and had felt nothing but impatience. She had told herself Vivian deserved it. People who have no conscience are very skilled at building the case for why their victims earned what was coming. But Camille had made one catastrophic miscalculation. She had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, that the woman she was betraying had already survived one complete destruction of her life, and that a woman who has rebuilt herself from nothing once carries, in the architecture of how she thinks, a blueprint for surviving anything. At 11:41 in the morning, Dr. Elliot Carver walked out of Vivian's delivery suite. He walked with the measured pace of a doctor carrying difficult news, shoulders set, face composed in that particular medical expression that prepares a family for words they do not want to hear. Donovan saw him coming and straightened. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Elliot's face with the specific focus of a man calibrating his reaction in real time. "Mr. Hartford," Elliot said. "How is she?" Donovan asked. The question landed with just enough tremble to be convincing. Elliot looked at him for a moment that stretched 3 seconds longer than it should have, long enough to be felt, not long enough to be explained. Then he said, "Your wife is stable." Donovan blinked. "Stable?" "Completely." Elliot's voice did not waver. "Her vitals normalized approximately 20 minutes ago. The critical readings were the result of a monitoring calibration issue we identified and corrected." He paused, and in that pause something shifted in his expression. Something precise and deliberate moved behind his eyes. "She is awake, Mr. Hartford. She is asking for you, and she has asked that Miss Rowe join you as well." Down the hall, Camille stood up slowly. The smile she had been carrying all morning was still on her face, but it had changed shape. It had gone from warm to uncertain, the way a flame changes just before it goes out. Donovan said nothing, but the color, the particular specific color of a man whose plan has just shifted beneath him like ground that was never solid, left his face in a single moment. He walked toward the suite. Camille followed, and when the door opened, what they found was not a dying woman. Vivian Hartford was sitting upright in that hospital bed, her 3 newborns in the bassinet beside her, her dark eyes clear and level, and carrying the specific calm of a woman who has not just survived, but won. On the table beside her lay a tablet. On the screen of that tablet was a recording, and the recording was playing. Donovan's voice filled the room. "After the babies come, we move fast. Our everything she built, it's ours." Camille's hand went to her mouth. Donovan's legs, for just a moment, forgot how to hold him. Vivian looked at them both, the husband who had signed away his integrity for greed, and the best friend who had traded a sisterhood for an apartment in Vancouver. And she said with the quietness of a woman who no longer needed to raise her voice to be heard, "Sit down. Both of you. We have a great deal to discuss." What is on that recording, and how much has Vivian captured? What does she say next? And what does the document on the bedside table beside the tablet actually contain? And when Donovan tries to speak, tries to explain, tries to dismantle what is sitting right in front of him, what does Vivian do that nobody in that room, not even Dr. Carver, sees coming? There is something the world never tells you about justice. It tells you justice is loud. that it arrives with sirens and courtrooms and the satisfying crash of everything wrong being publicly dismantled. But the truest kind of justice, the kind that is built by a woman who has already lost everything once and refused to stay lost, is quiet. It is documented. It is precise. And it arrives not as an explosion, but as a door closing, firmly, finally, and forever. Vivian Hartford had spent 3 years loving a man who was cataloging everything she owned. She had spent 6 months growing 3 lives inside her body, while the man beside her at every ultrasound was simultaneously moving her assets into the architecture of a betrayal. She had spent one night, the longest night of her life, lying still in a hospital bed, at listening to her future being discussed like a property transaction. But she had spent those same hours building the case that would dismantle all of it. The recording on the tablet was not the only recording. That was the first thing Vivian said, after she told him to sit down and the color finished draining from Donovan's face. She picked up the tablet and she set it aside, and she reached for the folder beneath it. A folder that Dr. Carver had quietly held in his office safe since 3 o'clock that morning, when Vivian had finished dictating its contents to him, and he had printed every page. Inside that folder was 6 months of work. There were financial forensics, compiled by a private firm Vivian had engaged quietly, and was paying them from a personal account that existed entirely outside the business structure Donovan had access to. The documents traced, transaction by transaction, the money Donovan had been redirecting from subsidiary accounts into an offshore structure held under a name that was not his own, but was registered to an address that was Camille's mother's house in Phoenix. There were photographs, time-stamped, geotagged, of Donovan and Camille together in the Vancouver apartment, in a restaurant in Seattle, in a car outside the law firm where the fraudulent power of attorney amendment had been drafted. There was a sworn statement from Vivian's personal attorney, who had been retained 4 months ago after Vivian noticed the first discrepancy in a quarterly report and had chosen, rather than confront it immediately, to document it. And at the back of the folder, behind everything else, were 2 documents printed on clean white paper, clipped together, already signed by Vivian and witnessed by Dr. Carver in the early hours of that morning. The first was a divorce filing. The second was a termination of Donovan Hartford's position as Chief Executive Officer of Hartford Voss Enterprises. Effective immediately, irrevocable, and accompanied by a full forensic audit request submitted to the company's independent board that same morning via her attorney. Donovan looked at the folder. He looked at his wife. And for the first time in 3 years of marriage, Vivian watched him drop every performance simultaneously. The charm, the composure, the carefully constructed version of himself he had sold her on the night they met. What was left underneath was smaller than she expected. Somehow that was the saddest part. "Vivian," he started. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, simply. "The way you close a chapter that no longer serves the story." She turned to Camille last. There was a specific pain in looking at her, different from the pain of looking at Donovan, because Donovan had always been, on some level, a stranger she had chosen to trust. But Camille had been something rarer. She had been the person Vivian called at midnight when the loneliness of rebuilding alone became too heavy. She had been the one who knew about the family who threw her out, the shelter, the 3 jobs, the first business deal that almost failed. She had been given the architecture of Vivian's interior life, and she had used it as a blueprint for how best to hurt her. And Vivian had written Camille's termination letter herself. It was 1 paragraph. It cited a conflict of interest. It was legally unassailable. But what made Camille's breath catch was not the legal language. It was the handwritten line at the bottom, beneath Vivian's signature, that said simply, "I found you homeless. I want you to remember that I could have left you there. I didn't, because I believed in who you could become. That is my only regret." Camille left the room without a word. It was, Vivian reflected, the most honest exit she had ever made. Security escorted Donovan from the building that afternoon. The board convened an emergency session by evening. By the time the city lowered its voice again that night, Hartford Voss Enterprises had a new acting CEO, Vivian's longtime deputy, a woman she had mentored for 4 years, who had spent those years being quietly, consistently overlooked by the man who was now being walked out of the lobby with a box of his personal items and a severance agreement that his own fraudulent conduct had reduced to the legal minimum. Vivian did not watch him go. She was in the nursery suite, her 3 babies arranged in their bassinets beside her, 2 boys she named after the father she lost and the version of herself that refused to die, and a girl she named simply Grace, because that was what survival looked like when it finally stopped bleeding. Dr. Elliot Carver knocked on the open door at 7 in the evening. He was off duty. He was carrying somewhat awkwardly a small stuffed bear that he announced, with the faint embarrassment of a man unused to soft gestures. He had been chosen by his 8-year-old son, who had insisted that newborns required immediate access to stuffed animals as a matter of medical necessity. Vivian laughed, fully, genuinely, the laugh of a woman feeling something uncomplicated for the first time in longer than she could measure. Elliot set the bear carefully in the corner of the bassinet. He looked at the 3 sleeping faces, and then he looked at Vivian with an expression that was not performed, not calculated, not constructed for effect. It was simply honest. The expression of a man who had spent 3 years as a widower, raising a son alone in the hospital his late wife had loved enough to leave him. Learning that goodness was not a reward system, but a daily decision. "How are you?" he asked. "Unimaginable," Vivian said. And the word, in which had once described what had been done to her, now described something else entirely. Something that was just beginning. They did not fall in love quickly. Vivian had learned at great cost the difference between a man who loved what she represented and a man who loved who she was. She watched Elliot the way she had once watched her first business, carefully, patiently, measuring not the grand gestures but the small consistencies. The way he spoke about his late wife, with grief and genuine gratitude, never bitterness. The way his son, a quiet, serious boy named Theodore, came to the hospital on weekends and did his homework in the corner of Elliot's office without needing to be asked. The way Elliot looked at her triplets, not as complications but as people. A year after that night, on a quiet Tuesday evening in the garden of the home Vivian had bought with the first profit she ever made, the home she had kept through everything because it was the first thing that was entirely, undeniably hers, Elliot Carver told her that he loved her. He did not say it like a performance. He said it the way he did everything, precisely, sincerely, without excess. And Vivian, who had once been a 19-year-old girl standing outside a closed door with a suitcase and nothing else, who had worked in the dark until she built her own light, who had laid perfectly still in a hospital bed and turned the worst night of her life into the first page of the rest of it, said it back. Not because she needed him, but because she had finally, after everything, learned the difference. The greatest things we build are not companies or empires. They are the version of ourselves that survives, intact, after the fire, and chooses, with full knowledge of what love can cost, to love again anyway. Dear viewers, you have just witnessed the story of a woman who lost everything twice, and built everything twice, and never once allowed anyone else to write her ending. This story teaches us that betrayal from those closest to us, though devastating, does not have to be our destruction. It teaches us that silence can be strategy, that patience can be power, and that the most unimaginable thing a broken person can do is refuse to stay broken. It teaches us that the people who underestimate us are often the ones handing us the very tools we need to rise. Or drop in the comments below. What was the biggest lesson this story gave you? And if you were Vivian, what would you have done the moment you heard that phone call? Would you have confronted them immediately or played the long game the way she did? Let us know. And if this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you will carry, subscribe now, because every week we bring you stories that don't just entertain, they transform. 5 years after that night, the name Vivian Hartford meant something different to the world than it once had. It used to mean wealth. It used to mean the kind of polished, carefully managed success that people admired from a distance. A woman in the right rooms, wearing the right things, married to the right man. A name that looked complete from the outside, but was quietly, methodically being hollowed out from within. But now, 5 years later, the name Vivian Hartford meant something the glossy version never could. It meant survival with receipts. Hartford Voss Enterprises had not just recovered from the internal fracture that Donovan's betrayal had caused. It had grown beyond anything Vivian had projected in her most ambitious forecasts. The forensic audit had uncovered the full depth of the financial redirection Donovan had engineered over 18 months, and every misappropriated dollar had been recovered through litigation that Vivian's legal team pursued with the quiet, methodical intensity of people who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where it was hidden. Donovan Hartford settled out of court. He signed away every claim, every counter-assertion, every carefully worded legal maneuver his attorneys had constructed. Because Vivian's documentation was so thorough, so layered, so forensically precise, that his own legal team had privately advised him, in language they chose carefully, that continuing to fight was not a strategy. It was a performance with a predetermined ending. He moved to a small city 3 states away. He did not remarry. He did not rebuild. He became in the quiet taxonomy of people who gamble with other people's lives and lose simply a cautionary detail in a story that was never really about him. Camille Rowe's ending was lonelier. Without the Vancouver apartment, which had been included in the asset recovery, its financing traced directly to the redirected funds, and without the salary and title and professional identity that Vivian's company had given her, she discovered that the life she had been so certain was arriving had never actually existed. It had been a projection, built on someone else's foundation, sustained by someone else's generosity, and it collapsed the moment that generosity was rightfully withdrawn. She called Vivian once, 14 months after that hospital room. Vivian took the call. She listened to everything Camille said, the apology that started formal and became somewhere in the middle, genuinely broken. She listened without interrupting, without softening, but also without cruelty. Because Vivian Hartford had learned, in the years since that night, that carrying hatred for the people who betrayed her was simply a way of letting them continue to occupy space in a life they no longer deserved access to. When Camille finished, Vivian said, "I forgive you, not for you, for me, but forgiveness is not a door. Don't call again." She hung up. She did not cry. She went back to her children, the triplets. Elliot had taken to calling them the board because they made every family decision by loud, simultaneous, non-negotiable consensus. Were 5 years old and entirely themselves. James, I named for Vivian's father, had his grandmother's eyes and his mother's absolute refusal to accept any answer that didn't fully satisfy him. He asked questions the way other children breathed, constantly, urgently, as though the world were a puzzle personally addressed to him. Cole, named for the version of Vivian that had refused to disappear during the worst years, was quieter, watchful in the way that deep water is quiet, still on the surface and full of movement underneath. He was the one who noticed things, who remembered, who at 5 years old had already developed the specific habit of sitting beside people who seemed sad and simply being present with them without requiring anything in return. Grace lived up to her name in ways that occasionally made Vivian have to excuse herself from the room for a moment to collect herself. She was generous in the instinctive, unconditional way that some people simply are, handing her snacks to strangers, insisting that every person who entered the house be offered something to eat, once attempting to give her favorite stuffed bear, the one Dr. Carver's son Theodore had chosen in the hospital, to a child she saw crying in a park, because she could not understand keeping something soft and comforting for yourself when someone nearby needed it more. Vivian had held Grace's face in her hands that evening in the park and looked at her daughter for a long moment. This small, certain, open-hearted person she had grown and protected and nearly lost before she even arrived, and thought, this is what I was building toward, not the empire. This. Theodore Carver was 10 years old and had, in the way that children do when they are ready and the conditions are right, simply absorbed the triplets into his understanding of his family without requiring a formal announcement. He helped James with his questions when the answers were scientific. He sat beside Cole in comfortable silence when Cole needed it. He let Grace reorganize his bedroom bookshelf by color rather than subject, which was, as anyone who knew Theodore understood, an act of love so significant it required no commentary. He called Vivian Viv, which she had told him once was what her father used to call her. He had switched to it immediately and permanently. With the straightforward loyalty of a child who understands instinctively that some things are honors rather than informalities. Elliot Carver was, at 41, a man who had learned the specific lesson that life teaches through loss. That the second chapter of a good life is not a replacement for the first, but a continuation of it, written in a different hand, about different things, and no less real for being different. He still ran Crestwell Medical Center with the precision and integrity his late wife had believed him capable of when she left it to him. He still arrived early and stayed late and treated every person in that building, from the attending physicians to the overnight custodial staff, with the same level of direct, genuine respect. He had not changed those things, but he had added to them. Now, he had added Sunday mornings in the kitchen of a home that was full of noise and small feet, and a woman who reviewed quarterly financial reports over coffee and occasionally read them aloud to him in a voice that he privately thought was the best sound he had encountered in his adult life. He had added the specific, recurring joy of being needed, not for his resources or his status or the architecture of his professional life, but for himself, for the way he thought, for the way he listened, for the way he could be trusted completely with the interior life of a woman who had learned to trust at enormous cost and had chosen, with full knowledge of that cost, to trust him anyway. On the morning of their second wedding anniversary, he found a note on the kitchen counter in Vivian's handwriting. Akrit said, "You were the one thing I didn't plan for. You were the best thing that ever went unplanned." He kept it in his coat pocket for the rest of the day. He kept it after that too. There is a question that the world asks of women who have survived the kind of devastation Vivian Hartford survived. How did you not become hard? It is the wrong question. The right question is, how did you choose, after everything, to remain open? And the only answer that ever actually fits, is that hardness is not strength. Hardness is what happens when someone mistakes the closing of a wound for the building of armor. True strength is scar tissue, flexible, resilient, permanent proof of damage survived, carrying the memory of the wound without being defined by it. Vivian Hartford had scar tissue in abundance. She also had 3 children who reached for her in the dark. A man who looked at her like she was both remarkable and simply, quietly, his. A company that bore her name and her vision and the fingerprints of every year she had spent building it from nothing. And a life, full, imperfect, layered, unglamorous in its daily particulars and extraordinary in its overall shape, that belonged completely and irrevocably to no one but her. She had pretended to die so that she could fully live. And what she built in the living was, without question, the most unimaginable thing of all.